we are recording this webinar today, and we will be emailing out the recording to everyone along with the slides for you to have for yourself and to share with your colleagues if you would like. So be on the lookout for that in the next few days. Again, that will come via your email. Also, our speaker today is happy to take questions both throughout the webinar and at the end. There will be a time for a Q&A portion of the webinar. So if you have any questions, please submit them in the comments or in the Q&A section as they come up throughout the presentation, and we will be sure to get to them. So let's go ahead and get started by introducing our speaker today, Dr. Tim Oates. He is the co-founder and chief data scientist here at Synaptiq, with over 20 years of experience in guiding organizations and companies of all sizes, applying AI and machine learning to business problems across industry. Tim earned his PhD in computer science from University of Massachusetts Amherst with a focus in AI and machine learning, and was a postdoctoral fellow at the MIT lab. Thank you, Tim, for speaking today. We're excited about this presentation, and I'm going to let you take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Sam. I appreciate it. So just a couple of words about Synaptiq, the company. We've been around for a little over 10 years now. And back in the early days, my co-founder and I just did AI machine learning projects. A company would come and say, hey, we've got this machine learning thing. We want you to solve it, write the code, give it to us. Okay, right, goodbye. Thank you. You did a great job. So over time, though, what we've discovered, and as AI has matured, is that companies are starting to integrate AI technologies, and I'll include machine learning in that, into sort of much more complicated, all-encompassing systems. And so over the years, we've done more work on product design, user experience, user interface, intelligent user interfaces and experiences. And so now we think of ourselves as an intelligent products company. That is, we're interested in the sort of end-to-end process, including strategy all the way through deployment of products, either for internal or external customers. And so the topic today of how do you measure the return on investment for projects in the AI space is kind of timely and one that we deal with all the time. So the roadmap for today is relatively straightforward. I just want to talk about hype versus reality in AI. And I went back to grad school in 1993 to work on a PhD, and it was actually an AI winter, right? So we've got these periods where AI flourishes and then it falls off. And I've lived through a couple of AI winters. And the AI winter when I went to grad school was basically due to overblown promises, largely among academia, about the potential impacts of AI on industry. I don't think we're there. I think that the AI technologies today are incredibly powerful, but I think one has to be careful about how you go about deploying them and figuring out how you're going to use them. So anyway, so we'll talk about that for a little while. Then we'll talk about why is it that looking at ROI for AI projects is uniquely hard. I think ROI in general can be challenging, but the bottom line on this is there are a lot of moving pieces, and we'll talk about those moving pieces. And then, my advice is to think like a scientist. So I'm a professor of computer science and have been since 2001. And so, I think I'm, at this stage reasonably good at kind of designing experiments to answer questions, and especially in the AI and machine learning space. And I think you have to take that mindset when you're trying to be sure that you're able to get the most out of your AI projects, or at a minimum to justify their existence to upper level management. So then I've got a few case studies where we built systems. So there are two kinds of case studies. One is one that we did a number of years ago, where the company we worked with did a remarkably good job of measuring ROI. And so I'd like to use that as an example. And in fact, it's going to connect back to the think like a scientist theme. And then a couple of others where the ROI is kind of different, right? It's not directly bottom line, but I think you'll see, how it works. And then I'll have some concluding thoughts. Now, if there's time at the end, it would be great if anyone out there has a project that they're working on at a company and you wanted to kind of have a little bit of a back and forth about how to measure the ROI. I'd love to be able to do that. So To start, let's talk about hype versus reality. So here is a graphic from a McKinsey report, and I'm not picking on McKinsey, right? I think they're not part of the hype machine. I think what they're doing is this is very data driven. But if you look at the numbers here, notice that the numbers are in trillions of dollars, right, on the global economy. So that left-hand bar over there is how much impact can we get from traditional machine learning, deep learning, and by traditional, it means not generative AI or generative machine learning. And then that little, blue bar on the left says, well, we can get an additional 2.6 to 4.4 trillion dollars, right, of impact out of that. And it goes all the way over to the right. And so they're, thinking that the total AI economic potential is, 17 to 25 trillion dollars. So those numbers are mind-boggling. So there's clearly a lot of interest there. And if you work in a company, I have no doubt that you're thinking about ways of trying to leverage AI. And interestingly enough, there'll be some more information in here in a minute on the ways that you're likely doing that, which is a lot how I'm using it. But then the reality is, potentially, is there was this report that came out from MIT earlier this year with the headline 95% of generative AI pilots at companies are failing. So, um, I think the headline is, maybe not overselling the statement, but it's definitely alarmist. And I read it. I read the report, and I think they did a good job of the methodology. Rather than focusing on the 95% part, I would say a lot of generative AI pilots at companies are failing. And so the question is, why is that? So I want to dig into that just a little bit because I think it'll help us see how we might want to think about ROI. So there is this very interesting statistic about general purpose LLMs versus kind of bespoke agentic or generative AI systems. And if you look at companies that have either investigated or piloted or successfully implemented, you can see two things. That the majority of the focus is on general purpose LLMs, and the fall off is less steep. So if you go 80% have investigated, 50% have piloted, 40% have successfully implemented, that's so sort of a 50% fall off from we looked at it to actually we got the thing working. On the bespoke or the task specific, you go from 60% investigated to 5% have successfully implemented. So that's a massive fall off. So what we're seeing is that there's a lot more success with freely available online tools. And when I say that, I mean things like ChatGPT or Claude or any of the command line interfaces that people are using these days for coding. And so the question is like, what's going on? Like, what do you actually get for $20 a month, which is, what the pro plan for Chat GPT might cost you. I'm using a ton of them. I'm spending so much money on LLMs these days. It's driving me a little bit crazy personally, actually. So about 40% of companies have purchased LLM subscriptions, but 90% of employees are using LLMs regularly. So what does that tell you? That tells you that individuals out there find generative AI to be incredibly useful and powerful in their day-to-day work. And so the question was, well, why are you doing that? Why aren't you using, sort of other systems, for example, that might have been engineered by the company to perform your specific work task? And the answers are basically, I trust it more. I'm familiar with the interface. And they felt like the answers were better from the general purpose language models. And so like the question is why, right? So if you look at people who are building these task or domain specific systems, they would say, well, they break in edge cases. I can't customize it, right? And again, this is like, oh, I built you a system and you're going to use the system to do part of your workflow. Well, my workflow, I like it to be a little bit different and I can't do that. Or there's too much manual context every time. It doesn't remember things like I want it to. And ChatGPT is wonderful. It's like, oh, I had this conversation before. Let's go pick that thing back up. And it knows exactly where it is. And it doesn't learn from our feedback. So here's a quote from a lawyer who had a customized tool for, or a special purpose tool for, I think, doing contract work. And they said our purchased AI tool provided rigid summaries with limited customization options. With ChatGPT, I can guide the conversation and iterate until I get exactly what I need. The fundamental quality difference is noticeable. ChatGPT consistently produces better outputs, even though the vendor claims to use the same underlying technology, right? So, here's an interesting case where somebody says, well, give me a $20 a month subscription to ChatGPT. I am going to find that to be much more useful than if you go spend 50, 75, $100,000 on building a thing that wraps ChatGPT because it doesn't sort of work the way I want it to work. And I have much more flexibility. Okay. So, there are these headwinds if you're trying to deploy a custom solution. But let's think about why measuring AI ROI is uniquely hard. And, I would claim that it is for a few reasons. One is you get what you measure and incentivize. So here's a little cartoon that says, "Hey, I'm pleased to be able to report considerable efficiency savings. Right, costs are going down, but complaints are going up." So the standard approach, I think, when looking at ROI in AI systems is if you go, "Hey, I want it to hit my bottom line directly," right? Like we need to do things at lower cost. That might incentivize people who work in the organization to potentially not use the AI tool and look for sort of faster, more direct ways to have short-term impacts if that's what they're being measured on. So let's think for a minute about some of the ways in which AI systems can deliver long-term value. And so I think you have to align the things that you measure and the way you incentivize people with what AI systems can do. So there are the standard efficiency metrics. So on a task that you perform, how much time am I saving? Have I completely automated a process? And in that way, can I get the number of tasks that an employee is able to complete in a unit of time, a day, a week, or a month to be higher, right? There's also quality. So just like the cartoon, we're saving time, but our customers are all annoyed. So are you keeping customer satisfaction high? Are you reducing errors? Are you making more accurate decisions? These are all things that you have to think about, especially as AI systems are much more capable and able to do things. They're able to sort of engage in the decision-making process. But then there's also capabilities. Have I enabled new tasks? Have I amplified skills? Are people being more creative? And I will say that in our work at Synaptiq, the sort of the most satisfying implementations of AI look like this, right? So, and I'll talk about a case study or a couple of case studies later where you have highly skilled people like immigration attorneys who are doing mundane paperwork because it's part of their job and it has to get done. But if you can give them an AI system that can kind of take that over, allow them to plow through that very quickly, then they spend more of their day using the parts of their brain that they went to school for. There's also strategic metrics. Have I gained some competitive advantage? Is the market liking me more? Am I innovating faster than my competitors? And then again, very important, how do our employees like it? So, it potentially is not satisfying if the employee is performing some task and they have an AI helping them and they're just sort of like babysitting the AI all day. They're getting it done faster, but their work is more boring and more mind-numbing. So are the employees satisfied? Are we keeping employees? Are they learning new skills? Now, so there are lots of ways in which you might think about measuring to establish the return on investment, which are, again, dollars and time are important, but I think you have to think a little bit more broadly with AI systems. It's also the case that there's a lot going on. So when you're trying to measure ROI, typically, if you're deploying AI, there might be process changes or organization changes. And so sort of isolating the impact of AI can be hard. If you're changing lots of stuff at the same time, just so you can get the AI deployed, what is it, right? Is it that the new interface is just easier to use regardless of whether the AI is there? It's also the plumbing is expensive. So often there's a data lake being built, there's integrations, there are infrastructure costs, and those are shared across projects. So, we've had clients in the past who said, okay, great, what we're going to do is we're going to build data lake. And then once we've got the data lake built, we're going to do these AI applications. And then they look at that first AI application that rolls out and they go, man, that was expensive, right? But that's because you had to do all this hard work of getting the data sort of in a location where you could begin implementing the AI projects. And so you have to keep that in mind, right? You're going to amortize that piping, that plumbing over a large number of projects. And then if you don't have users adopting, the ROI is zero. So it is the case that a lot of failures are just about people adapting to change. So the models, the AI systems, they tend to perform pretty well, but there are other more trivial things. Here's a new interface. Users don't want to use it. It's messing with their workflows in ways that are annoying, and they're just not going to deal with it. It's easier in the short term to use the old system. You also have to think about risk and governance. So, compliance failures. If I have personally identifiable information and that stuff's leaking all over the place because I'm using a chatbot in a bad way, that's really not good, right? And that can lead to real losses. And then importantly, you have to think long term. So, like, as I said before, it's this long-term multi-year capability building. You can do one-off pilots, and we'll talk about some of those in a minute. But the big gains are going to come from an investment that you're going to start kind of reaping the benefits of in lots of ways over a long period of time. It's just like the data lake that I was mentioning. So, okay. So what I said was I think when you're thinking about ROI on AI, you have to go into it eyes wide open, knowing that you have to think broadly about the kinds of things you're going to measure. You also have to think really hard about isolating effects and being very clear about that. So we're going to go through sort of thinking like a scientist. And I think I've got, okay, good. Right. So I've got a sample use case where we're going to go through and say, here's this thing that we're doing with AI. Let's think about how to design a very sound experiment to be able to measure or to establish ROI. So you've got customer support agents, and they're spending a lot of time just writing emails, responding to customers. And what you'd like to do is to speed that up. Um, I can imagine that those can be very rote, and I'm sure that there are systems out there that have templates you can fill in. But the idea here is we're going to have an AI drafting assistant. So we've got some language model connected up to a knowledge base, and it's going to have there's going to be a button in the interface that says, "Hey, can you just draft this email for me?" And you have to establish the ROI because you spent money on it and you want to make sure that it's worthwhile. So we're going to go through I don't know, four-step process here where the first thing to think about is what are the relevant variables. In this case, there are kind of three buckets to consider. One is the independent variable, and that's what you can control. So I can control whether a customer service agent has access to the drafting assistant. So the treatment condition is you're going to get the drafting assistant. The control is you don't get it, right? It's just like when you're testing medications, like some people get the medication, some people get a placebo. The dependent variables are the things that you care about. So what's the average handle time? How long does it take me to handle one of these things, a ticket in minutes? How many tickets have I resolved per day? What about customer satisfaction, right? The cartoon earlier had efficiency going, cost going down, but essentially customer satisfaction or complaints going in the opposite direction. And then escalation rate. What fraction of these things have to go from tier one to tier two customer support? And then the final bucket, super important actually, is what do you want to track to avoid confounders, right? And the idea here is if you take some people and give them the AI interface and some people and don't give it the AI interface, you have to be careful about who you give it to because it might be that there are certain ticket types, like maybe technical requests for technical help are just harder to deal with than billing. And if you give the AI to the people who are doing technical requests that are just challenging out of the gate, you're not going to see as big a bump. Or maybe if you give it to people who have been with you for a long time, they're going to be whizzes at it, but the sort of new agents are going to have a little bit more a harder time. So you have to kind of think about factors like that, and we'll see why that's important in just a second. So once you've kind of figured out, here's what I'm going to control, here are the sort of variables I'm going to measure to see if I'm having an impact, and then what kind of things do I need to think about, and when I'm choosing people to for the treatment and control conditions, is I'm going to have a hypothesis. And like this is important and has to be informed by the business and other people in the C-suite. You need to go to people who are going to have decision-making power over the money and say, hey, like, is this good? If we can establish this, you'll go great, thumbs up. And so here we could say giving tier one support agents access to an AI drafting assistant will reduce the average handle time by at least 20% without decreasing customer satisfaction, resulting in a positive ROI over 6 months. In this case, in this example, it's going to be monetary ROI. The key is it has to be specific. I have to measure it. And so I've, look at the variables we talked about where we looked at measuring AHT, looking at CSAT, and we'll look at the cost side in a minute. And it's got to be tied to ROI. And importantly, I think you have to get people to buy into it for these AI projects. So once you've got that, like we're going to measure these things, here's our hypothesis. You have to do a couple of things. You got to figure out what your treatment and control conditions are. You're just doing A/B testing, right? Which is a very common term in industry. So, the control group is we're going to give people the standard user interface with no drafting assistance. Same interface, right? Then the treatment condition, they're just going to get a little button that says, hey, like draft a reply. And that's going to pre-fill an answer based on the ticket text and previous messages. And the agent can look at it and go, yeah, right. I think I'll edit or whatever. Importantly, everything else has to be identical, right? So there's no differences in ticket routing or permissions or reporting. The only thing that's going to be different from the agent's perspective is just boom, I'm going to push a button and get a draft up there, right? So that allows us to isolate sources of variation to just the sort of AI component. Then you got to figure out unit of randomization. We'll talk about that in just a second, but we're going to randomly select agents. How long are we going to run it? In this case, like let's not run it for a day because maybe there aren't enough tickets going through, but let's do it for 4 to 6 weeks so we can kind of smooth out weekly patterns. You have to gather enough data so that when you compute numbers, you believe that they're real and they're not just an idiosyncrasy of having done it on a Thursday and a Friday or the Monday and the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, for example. And then the sample size is actually really important. And like I wrote this little bullet here, but I really kind of mean it. Talk to a statistician about statistical power. So it turns out that, when you do analyses, so the simple example is I've got a coin and it's got some chances of coming up heads that maybe isn't 50-50. If I flip the coin once and I say, oh, it comes up heads, then you go, oh, 100% of the time it comes up heads, right? But you don't know because you need to flip it more often to figure out what the distribution of heads and tails is. Exactly the same thing here. This is an area where I think, talking to an expert about how to choose the number of agents that you're measuring is important. And we can come back to that in a minute. And, but if you talk to somebody who knows statistics, ask them about statistical power. That's the key word. Okay, so now I've got my experiment all set up. We have to assign subjects to groups. And in this case, you're going to want to do a thing called stratified sampling. And so remember before we said, hey, we've got um, different kinds of agents, right? So some of them have been with us for a short time or a long time. We have different queues of customer support requests coming in. And so that population on the left-hand side is essentially, here's all the agents, and they have different properties, right? Some are new, some are old, some work on technical support, some work on other kinds of support. And so what you want to do is kind of isolate them, right? So you can make sure that you're sampling evenly from all those different kinds of agents or kinds of questions that are coming in. And once you've got them sorted out, I got all the greens and the blues and the pinks and the grays together. I'm going to choose 4 of each of those, for example, and now I've got a sample. And so now the idea is that the impact of the AI system is not going to be sort of hidden because you've got too many green people and not enough gray people, right? Like I've got too many expert agents and not enough new agents, for example. So stratify by the control variables and then measure. So now you're going to like send people out, go do your work. And you've got to make sure that there's infrastructure for saying, hey, who's the agent? Are they treatment or control? Do they get the AI assistant or not? What kind of ticket type or what's the queue? What are the things I care about? I care about the handle time. Was the AI assistant actually used? So the treatment agents might not have pushed the button. They might have just gone, oh, whatever, I'm going to type this thing up. What's the customer satisfaction if it's collected? And was it escalated? Then, you can go in and after you've done that, you'll compute statistics. Maybe the control group spent 8 minutes per ticket. The treatment group spent, 6.2 minutes per ticket, 22.5% faster, no significant change in customer satisfaction. Escalation rate might have been slightly lower, but whatever. So, then you can do a computation which says, well, if you've got this many tickets per year, we save this many minutes. This is how much our agents cost. That looks like an annual savings of about, $300,000. But then what you got to do is you got to go back and look because these AI systems can be expensive. As I said, I know because I've got subscriptions to like two or three of them right now personally. And so, you do this kind of ROI calculation. We sort of saved 320,000, but we spent 120,000, and so we're saving 180,000. So the idea there again is I'm just trying to say like be very methodical about it. And I think kind of having this, I'm a scientist, I'm running an experiment. It's got to be the case that when people come and they start trying to poke holes in what I did, and well, what about this, right? You have to have an answer for those things. So last bit then is I want to just kind of go through a couple of case studies. Um, One that we did quite a long time ago, and actually the year will come up in a minute, is we worked with Iron Mountain, and they've talked about this publicly a bit. They're a large company that they do a number of things these days, but back then they were mostly in the document storage and shredding business. So lots of businesses, I got to keep hold of payroll records for a long number or a large number of years in case the government comes and asks about taxes or things like that. And they had a set of customers that were quite large, but they also had a very long tail of small customers. So, like small businesses out there. And what they found was that they had a large accounts receivable backlog. Again, because I got a ton of customers. I don't know, like I'm a pet store and I use Iron Mountain to store my documents. And I get this bill from Iron Mountain and I look at it, I'm like, what? I don't know. I don't understand this thing. And I just throw it aside, right? It's not one of my big concerns. They found that a lot. So what they had was a hypothesis. They said, we believe, and this was based on anecdotal evidence, that if we call some of these small customers and say, hey, we're calling from Iron Mountain. We just want to know, do you have any questions about your bill? That the customer might respond and go, yeah, like I don't really understand what this charge is here. Help me understand this thing, and then they would pay it, right? So the hypothesis was that if they were smarter about picking who they call with their limited resources, they could work through some of that AR backlog. So we worked with them. They had it was a great setup for us. They had a sort of an internal tech champion. There was a manager there who was really interested and he was an early mover on AI and machine learning. And then they had a tech resource who was super interested in learning the technology. And so we kind of rode shotgun with them. And they trained a model based on some data they had gathered from, like, we called these people, you know, we've got information about them, who they are, their payment history, what kind of company, what their business is, the size of the account, and on and on. Can we predict those who are going to respond to a call by paying, right? So they did exactly what we talked about. They did an A/B test. They said we're going to take some customers and we're going to randomly choose from those customers. We're going to have a subset of them called and a subset of them not called and see what the difference is. Now, super important in this case, which I thought was very clever of them. And in retrospect, it's obvious, but again, they did a really good job of designing the experiment. Um, they randomly sample. So we got the model. The model says, hey, I think these are probably going to respond to you well if you call them. Responding well, meaning they'll go, oh, okay, I get it. I'll pay my bill now. So you've got this rank ordered list. So what they did was they randomly sampled from people who were high in that rank ordered list, but they also sampled from people who were unlikely to respond based on their order in that rank ordered list, right? So what you don't want to do is get into a situation where it's just the fact that you call them that makes a difference, right? Like the model hasn't learned anything. It's just calling helps, right? So they would say, let's call some that the model thinks are going to respond. Let's not call some. And then let's look deeper in the list. And what you would like to see is that calling doesn't matter as much as you get deeper into the list, right? Because the model's thinking, well, yeah, you can call them, but it's probably not going to do any good. So they had this great experiment where they had the, A/B testing of call versus no call, and they measured the payment rate. So, here is the Gartner research report that was written about it. This was published back in March of 2019. We did the work for them, a couple of years earlier. I can't remember the exact year. But, the summary here, they said applying machine learning to business problems is less forbidding than conventional wisdom suggests. Data and analytics leaders can learn from Iron Mountain Incorporated's accounts receivable team. They created an ML pilot with two FTEs working part-time for 6 months without data scientists or IT support. We were working with them that decreased time to settlement by 40%, right? So they like even in that paragraph, they're making arguments about we did this thing. Here's a concrete thing that business leaders should care about inside the company. We decreased time to settlement. Here's the resources we use, and here's how much time it took, right? So why were they so successful? I think that there are a few reasons. When it was very careful problem selection. So despite what I said earlier about how, like AI is this sort of multifaceted thing, it can have lots of different impacts. They had a direct connection to the bottom line, right? Like if you go to the CEO and you go, hey, I think I can reduce the time to sell by 40%, they would go, okay, great, go do it. Like, tell me how much you're going to spend, but yeah, you should totally do that. It was an extremely well-designed experiment. So, they, I think, designed the experiment after we worked on the project with them. And I remember hearing about it, I thought it was great, like beautifully designed. It's also an easy story to tell. So, they communicated it to a broader audience, outside of the company, but inside the company. Say it's like not flashy, so it's not this kind of customer-facing chat bot. It is this like back office thing. It's not flashy, but it's very impactful. And so I think, as I've been preparing for this webinar, a lot of kind of what I was reading was focusing on that idea of back office. There's a lot of gold to be mined there, right? Okay, so that was one. I've got a couple that are going to be a little bit quicker. Um, One was we worked on a patient intake for a healthcare company, and so think about every time you go to the doctor and the doctor hands you one of these little. I swear I've used exactly that one shown in the picture, the orange tablet. I hate them. Um, they're repetitive, they're impersonal, they're time consuming, but healthcare professionals or practices really need them. They get a lot of critical information. They reduce bad debt because I can swipe my credit card at the top of that thing, and it's just more efficient and the wait times are shorter and there's higher profit, right? And I love it. Like nobody's ever looked that happy to do an intake in a doctor's office, but that's from the company that sells them. So I guess they want you to think that you're happy when you do it. So it turns out we were working with a functional medicine practice, and functional medicine says we're not a cardiologist or a rheumatologist or any other ologist. We are going to look at you as a whole individual. We're going to consider all of your bodily systems as an integrated whole. And so what that means is when you go to a functional medicine doctor, you're answering a lot of questions. And so hundreds of questions, static order, like I can't stand it when I go to the doctor, I'm just my primary care physician and have to do it. And so what happened is people are just like they get bored, they're just kind of pushing buttons. I want to get done with this thing, especially near the end of the form. So what we did was we had a very simple solution. We looked at a bunch of historical data and we found questions that tended to be answered affirmatively together. So, for example, like this is the one that I always talked about with a client. If a patient says I've got anxiety, they're likely to report that they also have depression, and they're also likely to report that they have trouble sleeping. And so what we did was we looked at the historical data, and then we built a system that just asked a few key questions to kind of get you going, learn a little bit about you, and then we just started choosing questions where you're probably going to go, yeah, that's happened to me, or yes, I took that medication, or I've had that symptom. And so patients said they felt like they were talking to a doctor and it seemed like the app understood them. So what's the ROI here? In this case, the data is the ROI. So this was a company that was using all the knowledge that they had gathered about a large volume of patients to do a variety of things, sort of to improve the delivery of care in functional medicine. And so they were less concerned about, bottom line, in the short term in particular, what they cared about was, can I really get the relevant information out of my patients? Now, you have to measure it, right? So you have to think about how much more data am I getting? You can run these A/B experiments and all that kind of thing. Ultimately, it needs to come back to some value, some dollar value, or some improved healthcare outcome both are going to help the company. But here's a case where the return on investment was just, are we getting better, more complete data so that we can do more things with it to help people? And then I I apologize. I look at this slide and I think I was getting tired. So it's a lot of text. But this is my last case study. So in this case, we've worked with a couple of immigration law firms at this point, actually. And the immigration law firms are kind of helping big tech companies find talent who wants to come to the U.S. to work in these kind of high-paying, high-tech jobs. And it turns out it's just a pain, right? Like, immigration is hard. The government, for good reasons, requires a lot of information. There's a lot of forms, a lot of back and forth. And so what they did was they had lawyers who were like looking at documents that people uploaded to sort them out. Like, oh, okay, now we've got their resume, we've got a copy of their driver's license or their passport or this government form or that government form. And so what we did was we built a solution that automatically classified the immigration documents, right? So we're using machine learning, machine vision methods, deployed it to a managed platform that used Databricks, OCR, machine vision, language models, and a variety of APIs. And so then what happened was the attorneys could use the hours that they used to spend managing documents to give the clients a better experience, right? So clients are happy, the lawyers are spending less time just looking at documents and going, "Yep, that's a passport," and they're able to spend more time with the clients to help them through the process. So in this case, everybody's happy. And we co-authored a couple of research papers. And again, the ROI in this case is happier customers. Are our customers having a better experience? And so from what I've learned by working with a few immigration law firms is that's super important that, you know, the the feel of the experience. How do I interact with my clients? How do I write about them in documents that I'm sending to the government? So the customers are happy and the employees are happy. And again, these are lawyers went to law school. They don't want to be sitting around pushing, kind of like grunt work documents around. And so they get to do things that they enjoy more. Again, you have to think about measuring it. So, okay. So what are some concluding thoughts? Whoops. So, what can help you make you more successful when it comes to measuring ROI? One thing I would say is, think like a scientist. So, like, ask the deep and meaningful questions, not the shiny, fun ones. And as I said before, the back office is often where the real action is. So, customer facing is great. Like fancy, super impressive interactive dashboards that the C-suite looks at are great, but often the big movers are kind of, not in the fun, interesting, I shouldn't say that. They're not in the kind of glitzy parts of the office. They're like where the workhorses are who are getting things done. Plan and measure carefully. So I think that whole sort of thinking like a scientist is really about, I got to plan this thing out and I got to think about when I'm going to try and tell a compelling story about it, how do I back up every piece of that story so that when people poke holes in it, I'll go, nope, like I did it this way, and here's why you can trust it. And then the last thing I'll mention is kind of going back to that MIT report about how 95% of Gen AI projects fail. Again, I would read it as lots of them don't work out. It turns out that a trusted partner tends to make people more successful. So, they talked to people who had worked with external vendors like Synaptiq. Number one thing was they said they want to find a vendor they can trust. They need to have deep understanding of their workflow and minimal disruption of current tools. And again, like failures often happen because you build a thing that's just like a wart stuck on the side of it and it's just sitting over there and I got to go over and like it's not baked into my standard workflows. And if it's not, like if you're using Salesforce and it doesn't interact with Salesforce, people are going to go, "Oh, like I'm not going to do that. That's too much of a pain." And so this sort of idea of a trusted assistant who really understands the AI or the Gen AI space, who understands and has done measurements of ROI many times in the past, can help you to be more successful. Now, we've worked with lots of companies where they go, come in and help us and work side by side with our employees, and we kind of do knowledge transfer over the time, and then they go, great, we've seen it once, we can go do it again. And that's good too. But I think diving into the deep end of the Gen AI pool on your own, just out of the gate, is a sort of hard thing to do. So that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate you listening, and I would be very happy to take any questions that anyone has.
Thanks so much, Tim. As a reminder, you can put questions in the Q&A or in the comment section or the chat section of the webinar, of your Zoom webinar portal. And while we're kind of seeing if any questions come in, I did want to share Synaptiq's Resource Center where you can find some of the case studies and other webinar recordings that we have hosted for you to check out for viewing or again sharing with colleagues. So I will put that into the chat now. And if we don't have any questions, then I think we will leave it at we will leave it there for today. Thanks so much, Tim. Looks like we had somebody that wanted to pop on with a question.
Okay.
Okay, 1 second, Tim. We have someone that wants to pop in with a question, so I just want to get this
Okay, no worries.
sorted. Let's see. While we wait. Oh, the question was you mentioned, oh, a couple of questions coming in. You mentioned that users were more happy with Chat GPT instead of custom tools.
Right.
Looks like that's kind of the question that's come in.
Oh,
You can maybe speak to it a little bit more.
yeah, right. So, right. So here's what I think. Everybody that I work with or interact with, people ask me questions, and I'm like, "Well, did you ask ChatGPT?" So ChatGPT is my Kleenex, right? It's just the default brand name for LLMs. And so I think people are very used to doing just kind of little point solutions. Oh, I've got to summarize this document, or I'm giving a presentation. Here are a few documents that are going to feed into it. Can you give me an outline of the things that I might want to talk about? So that sort of very fast interaction has shown itself to be incredibly useful to people. And they're used to the flexibility of just having a free running conversation. I'm going to throw a document in there. I'm going to ask you some questions. We'll export some stuff. And so I think what happens is when people build these kind of custom solutions, is they're of necessity trying to constrain what the user can do because it's a business function. And I don't want them to kind of step outside their lane or do things that are going to be harmful to whatever that function is. And they tend to get frustrated. And so the way to kind of minimize that frustration, as I said on that previous slide, was to make sure that whoever's implementing it very deeply understands the workflow. So it needs to be the kind of thing where it really is just, I'm gonna click a button and I'm gonna get an email written that I can approve or not approve. And so there's the constraints that get imposed, but then if I've got to step outside my standard workflow at all, then users just hate it. So I think those are the countervailing factors.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tim. Any other questions? Feel free to pop them into that Q&A. Looks like we got the one or two that we've come in answered. Oh, okay. So the follow-up to that is, do you think this is because of the engineering that happens between models usage?
Yeah, I mean, I think engineering to the extent that I am imposing an interface and restrictions and of necessity because I'm implementing a business function. And if I haven't thought about, so if you sort of go back to, sorry, I hate it when people do this, but I'm going to do it. When you go back to the things that they didn't like, it was like the edge case, it's not handling my edge cases, or I can't customize it, or it just doesn't remember stuff that I expect it to remember. It's those things that drive people crazy, and you have to pay attention to those if you're going to get adoption. Because remember, there's a slide that was like, no adoption, no ROI. And so that's critical in terms of making sure you understand the deployment scenario.
Okay, great. One more follow-up to that one. Do you think ChatGPT is better at things like context engineering, the system prompt, etc.?
Uh, they all have their own strengths. So I just my personal preference, the way I've kind of handled my working is I often go to Chat GPT for generic kinds of things. So if I just want to have a brainstorming session about a topic, which I kind of do a fair amount, I tend to go to Chat GPT. If it's a coding related question, I tend to use Claude. I think it's Claude Code is better at writing code and it's much more integrated into the way I like to think about working with code. So no, I mean, I think what you have to do is you have to consider what's my use case, experiment a little bit, but then also think about costs associated with them, because they have very different cost models.
Okay, great. I think that is it for the questions that we have come in. So thank so much, Tim, and for everyone for joining us today. Again, this recording and the webinar slides will be sent via email, so be on the lookout for that. And we hope that you join us at a future webinar. And hope everybody has a good rest of your day. Thanks, Tim.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.